Okay, anyway, since this recording is available, we'll start. And I think last day we learned about the national policy and this snapshot of Sri Lankan economy. And we will learn about actually, I am not going into the economic terms in detail, but uh, learn about what happened to the Sri Lankan economy and how to overcome these present challenges mainly. But to learn that one, I have to introduce some terms related to the economic terms. Uh, so, First, we have to learn about the aggregate demand. No need to memorize these equations, but just keep it in mind, your mind these terms. Okay, this aggregate demand, uh, that is we call the C, I, G, and NX. We'll see what do you mean by C, I, G, and NX. Consumer spending on goods and services. That means whatever the amount consumers are spending on goods and services. Now, when you consider the economy, there are two terms. One is goods and other one is services. Whatever the thing. Now, let's say if you go to a supermarket and buy goods, that means you are spending on goods. Let's say if you go to a hospital and or maybe telecom provider and get the service, for that if you pay, that's the service. Then I means the private investment and corporate spending on non-final capital goods, mainly factories, equipment, etc. That means just think about this is private investment. No need to think in detail about what these terms. I means the private investments. G means the government spending on public goods and services, social services, mainly infrastructure, health, education, those things we call them. And to, let's say, to construct roads, all the things, whatever the government is spending, it is under G. Then NX means the net exports, that we call the aggregate demand of the economy. That means whole economy is constituted with consumers, private investment, government spending, and the net export. It could be net export. Here it's mentioned as the exports. That means exports minus imports. But when you consider the in Sri Lankan terms, if the imports are high, then value would be minus. Then you have to think about what are the main constitutions about the aggregate demand. And our next term I want to introduce it, gross domestic product. I think now when you read or when you watch the television these days, these terms you can hear. Gross domestic. Now everyone is telling about GDP, GDP, GDP. Then you should somewhat aware when you write the your answers to the question, you can use these terms. Then I know that you know at least these terms. Now let's say if someone asks you how to overcome the present challenges, then you can see we have to improve our gross domestic product. Then what do you mean by the GDP? Total market value of all final goods and services produced within the country. That means GDP means whatever the goods and services produced within the country. That's why D means domestic. Okay, that means gross domestic product. GNP means gross national products. That means output produced by country's citizens. Now here you may think what is the difference between GDP and GNP. Now GDP, now let's say Sri Lanka is an island. Within this island, what kind of goods and services are we producing? That's the thing under GDP. But GNP is Now, in our country, lot of people who are working in abroad, then they will send the money to us. Then the maybe now here output produced by country's citizens. That means now let's say if you go and work in a foreign country, your income, actually whatever the things they are remitting here, it's a different thing. Now whatever the income, now let's say if you are earning per month 10,000 US dollars, but maybe you are sending to Sri Lanka maybe 1,000 US dollars per month, but your 10,000 US dollars, when you calculate the GNP, they will consider that 10,000 US dollar uh, for the GNP, because why? It's the by the country's citizens. Now the problem is uh, when you when you compare the GDP and GNP, every time GNP is high, but that does not mean, let's say now you are working in a, let's say, European country and you are earning 10,000 US dollars per month. You may just send, okay, 1,000 US dollars per month to Sri Lanka for your parents and other families and relatives expenses. But that 9,000 US dollars you are keeping in that particular bank in your European country. Uh, Although the Sri Lankan government consider that as the GNP value, it may not be economically considered as a true value for the Sri Lankan economy. It's okay, as a GNP, it's true, but they may not able to utilize that amount unless you send that amount to Sri Lanka. But as a country, now there are countries, GNP is very huge. Now, when you look at the India and other things, so many countries, when you compare the GDP and GNP, there's a huge difference. Why? So many people, they are working in other countries, but the problem is when you calculate the GNP, correct values may not be reflected. Then nominal value and real value, that is also a very important thing. Nominal values based on current dollar terms. Real values reference to base year weights adjusted for the inflation. Normally, when you declare some inflation or whatever the thing, you will give a percentage. Why? That percentage based on some reference year. Now, same way, nominal value, if you represent it as a nominal value, now today's dollar is 300, let's say 330. But when you consider the real value, sometimes your dollar may be that time maybe 203, that particular reference here. Then every time you have to declare that you are referring a value as a nominal value or real values. Interest rates also, there are two types, floating or fixed interest rate. Floating interest rates, now let's say if the bank giving you a housing loan with a floating interest rate, they can change maybe every year or every month or maybe every quarter. It is floating, but fixed interest rate means they will give a fixed interest rates. Now with that, we will go to the other economic terms also. This is very much important. Now, every time you may hear that we are talking about, now you know the basic concept of the GDP, GNP, and other thing is balance of payment. What do you mean by balance of and aggregate demand also, you know. Now, when you write the answer, you can use these terms. Now, let's say, now if Sri Lanka's consumer spending is very high, aggregate demand is very high. But that's not the way you have to increase the aggregate demand. Definitely, you have to do the private investments you have to be high. If the government investments are high, that means you have to think how the government will raise that money, because government do not have any money. Government is not earning, they are collecting the taxpayers tax money. Now same way we have to think about the balance of payment. That is also very important thing when you give some indication to some country's economic condition. Now, what do you mean by economic balance of payment? Is a measure of all financial transactions flowing between one country and all other countries during a specific period. Now, once we understand this concept, you can see whether our balance of payment is positive or negative. Now, BOP is their key parameters are current account plus capital account plus financial account plus some balancing item. This is mainly for whatever the items with those are not categorized under current account, capital account, or the financial account. In theoretically, it should be zero, but when we go through these things, you can see whether our BOP is positive or negative. Now here, current account. Now what do you mean by current account? That's we have to learn. Now there are two terms in the current account: visible trade account and invisible trade account. In visible trade accounts, you are considering only imports and exports to the country. Now, if the imports are higher than exports, you will have a deficit. If the exports are higher than imports, it's a surplus. Now, think about this current account, visible trade account. What is the present situation about Sri Lanka? Normally, our imports are greater than exports. Then normally we have a deficit, but due to this stringent financial restrictions, when they ban all these imports, and if we can increase our exports, then exports will be higher than imports. Then our current account, we can have a surplus. That's the way government is trying to. Now, when you do the imports and exports, means we are getting the dollars into the country and we have to pay dollars to buy the goods. Now, when we have a shortage of the dollars, that means our exports are less, our imports are high, then automatically governments impose a huge ban, not a concessionary ban, it's a huge ban. Then automatically our imports are lowered. Then they try to increase the exports, but to increase the exports, so many things they have to carry out. Then other thing is the invisible trade account. Now, invisible trade account means the services sector. Now, services, tourism, remittances, whatever the interest we are getting. Now, normally in our country, we do not have that kind of interest. That means the developed countries, they are investing their money in other countries, then they are getting interest for their investments. But in our country, we do not have that kind of thing. But we are providing services like IT services, then maybe the aviation services, tourism, we are getting remittances. Now you can see in here, we can get a positive value. Now, whatever the thing we are getting as a earning to the country. Now, current account consists of visible trade account and the invisible trade account. Here, depends on the import and export, you will have a deficit and surplus. Here, invisible trade account, every time it's a positive value. But when you add these visible and invisible trade accounts, sometimes we may have a still deficit. Then just think about the capital account. What do you mean by the capital account? That means whatever the capital inflows and outflows. Now we are having inflows greater than outflows, then a surplus. When the outflows greater than inflows, it's a deficit. But in our case, normally uh, we are having our outflows are high, then surplus. But in our country, we do not have mainly capital inflows. Maybe for the projects, we can consider, let's say if this LRT project or whatever the project, there are inflows, but that inflows, we have to pay back that capital, then there are outflows. But if the country, our country, if our country takes so many capital investment projects, then we have, okay, our inflows may be high, but when you pay those things, our outflows would be high. But that we have to think. Then other main thing is the financial accounts. That's the borrowings. Now, government, every time they borrow loans from the other countries, mainly not to do the capital investment projects, just to buy the goods and services like that. Now, I think due to our economic crisis period, Sri Lankan government borrowed so much dollars from the India, China, including Bangladesh. Those are borrowings. Now, if our country having higher reserves and borrowings are less, then we are having surplus. But if the borrowings are higher than the reserves, it's a deficit. Now, when you consider these three accounts, financial accounts, our borrowings are very much higher than our reserves. Now, we do not have any reserves. Okay, maybe very small reserve. Definitely, we are having a deficit. Now, in current account also, we are having very high imports. Previously, we didn't have any ban or any control. People can import whatever the product. Then our visible trade account also had a deficit. And for the capital account also, that's the place, let's say, normally Sri Lankan government, they have taken so much loans to do the projects, but these projects didn't generate any out money. That means no return, no nothing. But they spend so much things then, and now we have to pay these capital investment. Now here, capital accounts and financial accounts, this is mainly related to the capital investments. This financial accounts mainly related to the we are having budget deficits and other things. Then government is taking so many loans for as the borrowings. This is also a type of borrowing, but normally these capital investment main objective is to carry out some capital projects, and after that, that project will give a return. Based on that return, if we can pay the capital investments and the interest as well, and if we can have a profit, then our outflow would be less. But as but in our case, we didn't have any return from these projects, but every year or every month we have to pay the capital that capital investment premium as well as the interest more than the benefits from that particular project. Then we had a deficit. Now normally in our country, now in theoretical case, If the country is stable means we should have at least zero there or positive value. But in our case, we didn't have that kind of thing. Now, when you look at understand the working of the economy, that means what are the economic indications? These words maybe you have heard so many times. We'll just learn about something: production, income, and employment. That means in a country, everyone is talking about what kind of production level, what kind of income, what kind of employment we are having, then price levels, inflation, all related to the economic terms. Now, previously we had our inflation around 90%, but now they are telling around 4 to 5%. That's that we call the price. Now, inflation directly related with the price levels. Then fiscal policy also referred to as the budget policy. Now, these days, everyone is talking about our policies. Now, that's why this particular topic is very important. Now we learn about the national policies, and now we are talking about the national economy. But these policies, if we have a consistent policies, then we do not have this kind of situation. Then demand management policies, also referred as monetary policies. Now in a budget, in a government economic policies, there are two types. One is called the fiscal policies. It's like government policy on borrowings, those kind of things. Then demand management policies, it's a monetary policy. It's like imposing tax and other things. Trade and industry policy. Now every government, we should have a trade and industry policy. Now our governments, they are telling, okay, we are trying to develop all the things, but you can think whether we have reached to that kind of level. Then balance of payment, foreign exchange flows and rates. Now that's the most important thing. Then international wealth and liabilities. Now let's say why USA having that kind of wealth, because they are every time trying to invest on other countries, and if they can invest, they can get the interest, they can get the profits. Those profits will add into their invisible trade account. Now when you identify a country, rate of growth of GDP, that means gross domestic product. Now, what is the rate that GDP is growing? Now, gross domestic product. Now, how do we increase the GDP? That means you have to have, now GDP is the goods and services produced within the country. Now, rate of growth of GDP means you have to increase the services, you have to increase the goods. Now, to increase the goods, okay, maybe it could be agricultural based goods, industrial goods, depends on the situation. Now, in our country, now if you identify our country, our main sector is the service sector. Then service sector will contribute to the GDP. Then rate of growth of per capita GDP. Now, when you divided by the number of population, now I think here I have mentioned the population, unemployment rate. Now, this is the economic snapshot I have shown to you. Now, these are the indicators. These indicators, I am not asking what is the unemployment rate or the per capita income of the country. That kind of question may not ask, but when you are writing the answers, you can link these things. Then rate of unemployment, rate of inflation, rate of domestic savings. Now when the government is giving a very high interest rates for the savings, automatically people tend to save the money in the banks. Then the rate will be, this is not the interest, this is the growth rate, like that. people will tend to save. Then if the government reduce the interest rate, people may not save in the bank, in the savings accounts. The rate of national investment, change in the structure of the economy, capital output ratio, so many indicators. Then we have to think about whether our budget is having a surplus or deficit. Now, what is the view of our country's present situation? But in historically itself, we had a deficit. Every time our main objective of the finance manager, finance minister, is to find the way to that means since our deficit is, we are having a deficit, finance minister, when he present the budget, he is trying to bridge the gap of the deficit by taking the foreign borrowings. Now, every time, maybe previously, without any control, we took so many loans. Now, when you have, when these financial institutions, mainly foreign financial institutions, when they come to know that they are asking loans to gap the deficit, bridge the deficit, they will give the loans with a very high interest rates. They are not, but let's say if they, if we ask for some capital investment, that's a different story. But this bridging the financial gaps, mainly due to the budget deficits, normally financial institutions, they will give at a very high interest rate. It's like same way that if you do not have sufficient money, if you go and take the cash advance from the credit card, they will provide the instant cash. You can get the money from the ATM itself, but these credit cards, they will charge interest rates maybe 28-30%. But let's say if you go to a bank and try to get the personal loan, now in present situation also, bank will charge around 14 to 15%, but it may take time. Now, for the budget deficits, when you consider the time horizon, government needs urgently that amount of money to bridge the deficit. Then they may take the loans from the financial institution at a very high level. Then they may not be able to pay back that particular loans. Then they will add the interest on interest, and maybe within 2 to 3 years time. Now let's say, now same way in the credit card, if you take a 30% loan within 3 years, you have to pay the 2 times of the capital. Same way to the country. Then revenue as a percentage of GDP, the growth of public debt, balance of payment, current balance, overall balance as a percentage of GDP. Once you calculate these values, you can show all the things in a different graphical format. Then they will have economic terms as well as the social indicators. That's also a very important thing in a country. But now you can think about these social indicators. Mainly these social indicators in Sri Lanka related to the health sector. Now everyone is talking about the deterioration of the health sector. Then you have to think now life expectancy at birth. Now previously Sri Lanka had a very good life expectancy at birth. Then infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, crude birth rate, crude death rate, total fertility rate. These terms, they will define in different words. Then the literacy level, that's also a very good social indicator. I think previously we had more than 90%. Then school enrollment rate, primary, secondary, since we are having free education, we are our country had a very good school enrollment rate, and it's from at in our legal system also. It is a essential item. That means a must condition. Every parent has to send their children to the primary and secondary education. Then prevalence of under five children malnutrition. Now I think most of the people, they are talking about the malnutrition today. That's one of the social indicators. When they do surveys with the primary school, they have identified that lot of students having this malnutrition. Then poverty head count. Now just think, I'm not giving any political things. Now just think about this recently adopted Aswasuma program. You can see how how many people applied for the Aswasuma. Now they are talking about 2 million, nearly 2.5 million people. That means these are not the individual people. It's like a families. Now, but previously, when you take this Samurdhi and other programs, it was less. But that's the way some external party can understand the Sri Lankan economy with the social indicators. Then now we learn something about the economic indicators, social indicators. Then other thing is political indicators. Now in a country, when you say the developed or the good country, all these indicators will have a very positive, especially the economic indicators, all the main economic indicators, GDP, growth rate, this balance of payment, all the things are positive. But now in our country, economic indicators also negative, but social indicators, we had a very good social indicators, but now it's deteriorating. Now just think about the political indicators. Now these political indicators are very important. Without the transparent political indicators, other countries may not invest on our country, and they may not grant any concessionary loans or the other infrastructure facilities or the helping to the country to development with this Asian Development Bank, World Bank. Now European countries, you can see whether they are imposing so many restrictions to Sri Lanka. Why? Just think about these things: political indicators, regularity of election. Okay, whether our country is having that democracy, freedom and fairness of elections, sharing of power, devolution of power, multi-party system. Now, when you consider North Korea, they do not have multi-party system. Russia, these communism countries, they do not have this multi-party system. But as a good political indicator, now in our country issue is the number of parties are so much. That's the issue. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of the media, incidents of political violence, incidents of grave crimes, violation of human rights, good governance, transparency, independence of judiciary, corruption. Now, I am not going into the details of each and individual items. Just think. Now, I think when I read these things in your mind, you can compare each of these items with whatever the things you know at present in Sri Lanka. Now, regularity of the election, just think. Okay. Then violation of human rights, corruption. Now that's why everyone normally these foreign investors, they may not come into the Sri Lanka and do any investment if the country is corrupt. Now, when you consider the indicators, now here we learn about economic indicators, political indicators, social indicators. Now, under the category of economic, political, and social, but same indicators, you can identify in different perspectives. Some are outcome indicators, some are input indicators. Now, outcome indicators, GDP, now all whatever the social, political, and economic indicators, mainly the social and economic indicators, some indicators that will measure the outcome, some indicators measure the inputs. Now, savings, investments, school rate enrollments, you can consider as the input. Not only these, everything. Now here I just want to emphasize you that same way these indicators, someone can say, okay, this indicator can be classified as an outcome indicator. This indicator can be classified as a input indicator. Then someone can say level of aggregation. Now aggregate indicators. Then GDP, life expectancy, fertility rate, age, literacy, regularity of election. Someone can indicate it as a aggregate indicator. Some can say sectorial indicator, agriculture, then the infant mortality, one infant. Now here you are looking at only the infant. Then primary school enrollment. Then you are just thinking about primary school. Then primary school dropout, you can check. Rate of voter participation. That's also very important thing. Now, let's say if government conduct an election, other countries, they may see, they will observe for how many people will come and cast their votes. That means rate of voter participation. Let's say if the voters participation is less than 30 to 40%, maybe they will elect the president or maybe the parliament. That does not represent a true picture of the country because voter participation is very low. Then we can go for a process indication. Process indicators for good governance. Now we are talking about, I think, from 2015 to 2019, that government theme was good governance. Now you can see whether that was there. Okay, I am not trying to compare the different governments, but this good governance, they use that word good governance. Then transparency, accountability. Now think about during that government, accountability is there or not. Then non-discrimination. Now if the good governance is there, these are the parameters you should have. For the transparency you should have for every, whether it's a national security item or the central bank issue, accountability should be there. Now still we couldn't find the who robbed the central bank. But there are ministers who is controlling the central bank. There's a central bank governor. So many people were there, but no one is taking the accountability. Then non-discrimination, equity, that means it could be male, female equity, or maybe the religious equity, whatever the thing. Then participation, inclusivity, and now we'll learn about other things. I think we just touch about this one, fiscal policies and monetary policies. Now, these are the things we are learning as a policies. Then we are having industry policies, trade policies, exchange rate policies, development policies. Now, so many policies. Now we are now previously we learned about the sectorial policies and the energy sector, transport sector, education sector. It's like a sectorial policies. But here mainly we are learning about the policies related to the economy. Now, one is the fiscal policy. When you consider the fiscal policy, it's the government taxation, expenditure, pensions, infrastructure, budget. Then we are trying to learn about these things with the fiscal policy. Then monetary policy, mainly related to the money supply constraints and other things. Uh, now let's say when you have a budget deficit, and if we do not have sufficient borrowings from the foreign countries to bridge the gap, what would be the government will do? They will print the money, because they have to pay the government salaries, they have to pay the poor people benefits and other things, they have to maintain the hospitals system, they have to maintain the education system, all the things. Then no other option, they will print the money. Then why the government has to print the money? They do not have sufficient reserves. Then to increase the money supply, what they will do? One is they will do the money printing, then that will be a monetary policy, then they will adopt the fiscal policies. Then what kind of fiscal policy they will adopt? Within the country, they will increase the tax values. Now, I think every professional, we are suffering for that, suffering from the very high tax values. Now, government, okay, but whether they will use that tax money in a proper way or not, I am not discussing. That's a different thing. But they government have two policies. One is the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. And other thing is the interest rate. Now, now why they give the higher interest rates to the fixed deposit? Because if the money is with the people, they will spend more, and that will increase there will be a direct impact to the inflation. If now previous government, they reduced the interest, okay, their objective was to go for a more construction activities to construct the houses and other things. They expect that reducing the interest will enhance the construction sector. Mainly, people will take the housing loans, and the people will construct the houses, then the apartments, so many things people will do. But the issue is, when the government reduced the interest rates, people thought no point of keeping money in the savings accounts. Instead of doing these capital investments, they use that money to buy the important items. I think our economic policies, our imports, these companies, okay, maybe these electrical items, all the things, they reduce the prices, and people buy so many electrical items, all the things, there will be huge outflow, in currency outflow. Since the interest rates are very low, people, they didn't save those money, and they use that money to buy the electrical items and other things, all these important items. Then we had a huge imbalance in our visible trade accounts, while our imports were huge, and exports, to increase the exports, we have to spend on factories and other things. People didn't invest on that kind of things, and our imports were very high. Then government decided, okay, they request all the banks through the adopting the monetary policies, they increase the interest rates. Okay, automatically people tend to save the money. That's the one way of controlling the money. That means you have to control the flow of money. That means money circulation, you have to control. Otherwise, inflation will be booming. That's the way they try to impose. Then other thing is, they have to cut the expenditure of the government expenditure. Now, how do you cut the government expenditure? They will reduce the number of overtime, that means overtime hours, allowances, and other things. Then automatically people may do not have sufficient money to spend lavishly like previously. And also when they impose the tax to your salaries, now previously, let's say if you get, let's say 500,000 Sri Lankan rupees, now that 500,000 rupees, if they impose a tax around 125,000 instead of 500,000 you receive, now you may get around 375,000. With that, you may cover your other expenses and other things. You may not have sufficient money like previously to spend. Now, other thing is the industrial policies, trade policies. That's also very important. What kind of international trade activities and other things. Then exchange rate policies, that's also very much important. Previously, we had a fixed exchange rate policy due to the IMF guidelines. Now we are having the floating interest rate. That means market, money and market, demand and supply for the dollars or maybe the foreign currency, that will determine the exchange rate. Then development policy, that's also very important thing. With these development policies, if we have a flexible development policies only, we can attract foreign direct investments. Then there are two items we call the expansionary and contractionary fiscal policies. What do you mean by the expansionary? That means expanding. Contractionary means it's contracting. That means you are trying to adopt stringent conditions. Now, why we need needs and challenges, rising expenditure. Now we are having very rising expenditure, falling revenue, ballooning deficit, deficit financing. That means our main important thing, what are the needs Sri Lankan government has to do? Our expenses are rising, our revenues are losing, we are having a ballooning effect of the deficit. Then, and also we have to do the deficit financing, we have to do the social welfare. That's a must. Every country, we have to do the social welfare because we are having poor, low income people. This Asasuma, Samurti, or whatever the schemes we have to do. Then the free health service, free education services. Then we have to do the pay the past liabilities, debt servicing. Now, I think everyone is talking about restructuring of the debt. That means we are trying to delay the payments of our liabilities. Then we have to do some forecast likelihood of getting out of control. Now with this situation, central bank and the Sri Lankan government have to find the method to control this situation. That means they have to forecast. Then there will be implications. That's also they have to consider. Now when you adopt this kind of things, now in our country, we are having a high inflation rate. Then all the products, goods are very much costly. There are huge unemployment rate because the companies cannot survive with these conditions. Then there are adverse on private investment and expansion. Now you can see how much these construction companies, they have a huge impact. So many projects they were stopped. So many things. That means there are during a financial crisis, so many implications. Then how do you come out from this recession? Then definitely government should intervene. Normal, if you request private sector to intervene, they may not intervene because they may think why we are spending on these days. They will just keep their money without investing. They will just do their businesses for their survival only. They won't do any they won't stimulate the economy, but government should intervene and stimulate the economy out of recession. Now, when the country is passing through a recession, now typically last year we were gone through this recession. Still, we are going through this recession, but when you compare the today's situation and last year's situation, situation is worst. Now, how do we overcome with the? Did you think purely private sector they gave us support? No, mainly the government intervened. We have to control our expenditures. Government has to control the expenditures. Then maybe you can see they adopt the fuel quota. Why they add the fuel quota? Otherwise, we have to buy fuel around US dollars 500 to 600 million. We have to spend for the fuel as a foreign currency, and we are not only by selling the fuel, we are getting the LKR. Maybe in Sri Lanka, we are having the LKR, but during that time, I think you can remember banks, this petroleum corporation, when they order a ship, they are searching for the dollars. Why? They are having the rupees. After selling the fuel to the people, they are getting the local currency, but there is a huge shortage about dollars. Without dollars, we may not able to buy the basic needs. Now, how do the government interfere that one? That means during that time, government try to control the other expenditures. Maybe they will request all the banks to keep the dollars without giving any other payments. Maybe during that time, it was very difficult to find the dollars or to get the dollars for even to send some money to the student to pay their professional fees as well. Then when you have the balance of payment, that's a very important thing. You have to see what would be the situation. Trade is perennial deficit. That means you need this trade. Exports growth sluggish and imports rising. Exports are narrow based, debt based capital against FDI. Then there are so many challenges. Then why we have to think about the balance of payment? That's the very important thing. In the balance of payment, you can see there is a current account, capital account, and the financial account. Now, all the three accounts mainly related with the foreign currency inflows and outflows. Now, there will be a huge impact if we do not have sufficient foreign currency inflows. Maybe within the country, we will have LKR, but nothing we can get it from the other countries without foreign currency. Then, only option is, now you can see all the things happen to our country. Exchange rates crash. Now you can see as soon as we open the exchange rate to float, it's increased from 203 to around 370, 390. Okay, still it's not stable. It's around 330, 340, that level. Then we had the capital flight. Countries will face serious forex deficiency. Now Sri Lanka had that that means foreign exchange or foreign currency deficiency. Only option is will need bailout at the end. But okay, I think Sri Lankan government, they declared the Sri Lanka as a bankrupt country in last April. Maybe there are different opinions on that, but now if you remember the word, when Sri Lankan government requests the IMF, then we called it as the IMF bailout package. That means IMF bailout package means to overcome these balance of payment issues. Now, balance of payment to survive a country. Now, in a normally in Sri Lanka, we are importing all majority of our basic things. Now, for the fuel, we have to import. Medicine we have to import, then food items we have to import, mainly the basic food items. Now, if the country is developed, means if we have a self-sustained way of acquiring our food items, then we can reduce the imports on food. But our government policy, whether now with the bad policy on agricultural aspect. Now, previously we had self-sufficiency in the rice, but during this crisis situation, government took a very bad decision by banning the fertilizer or chemical fertilizer. Okay, maybe the concept-wise that may be very good decision, but it had a very bad impact on the financial crisis. Then, what are the fiscal deficit on balance of payment? Now, higher government expenditure typically has heavy import content. This means government expenditure affects balance of payment current account. Now, if the government expenditure is very high, now you have to think if the government expenditure is related to the capital expenditure, that would be better. But if the government expenditure is mainly related to balance the these import if the government is investing money on exports, that would be better. Now, our main objective is to overcome the deficit of balance of payment. It's like a day-to-day. Now, in your just think about yourself. Now, you may have in a bank, you may have a fixed deposit, but you are having day-to-day activities. It's you have to maintain the cash flow. Now, to maintain that cash flow, okay, maybe you will have your wallet. You may have some money. You may use the cash, or maybe you will use the credit cards. Okay, if you can buy whatever the goods and services by paying cash, you know you can balance your expenses. But if you take all your goods and services through by paying the credit card, there is a one day it will collapse you. That means you also may not able to pay the credit card. You may do not have sufficient credit to buy the product. Same thing. Now think about as a country, then country also facing the same thing. Then what would be the issue? Government will buy the short-term borrowings. Now I told when you buy the short-term borrowings, their interest rates are very high. Within 3 to 4 years, you have to pay the interest only as same as the capital. Then if the government have lack of right physical incentives for export, wrongful incentives increase import, could cause more trouble for trade balance. Now, other main thing is if we import whatever the things we can produce within the country, then people will automatically buy the foreign products because it's cheaper. And maybe sometimes government has to take very hard decisions. Maybe the uh, items produced within the country, maybe cost is more than the imported same product, but government has to identify whether it's an essential or non-essential item. Let's say if it's an essential item, maybe government should allow. If it's an non-essential item, definitely government should not allow the import. They have to promote the local production. But for the essential items also, government has to promote the local production. Otherwise, in the long-term sustainability, there will be a situation that huge outflow, foreign currency outflow for the essential items. Now, let's say main essential item is the pharmaceutical items. Now, if our country can produce whatever the pharmaceutical items within the country, then we can reduce the foreign currency outflow. But it's essential items. If we are not producing, government has to import those things. That's the balance between the imports and exports, but definitely that have a huge impact on the balance of payment. Then we have to see how the government fiscal policies relate closely to the growth. Now, I told what are the fiscal policies? I try to explain here. Taxation, this infrastructure also under fiscal policy, budget deficit and how they finance the budget, all the things related to the fiscal policies. These fiscal policies, you can see, now let's say incentives led export. Now these fiscal policies every time should direct towards the enhance the exports, promote the industrializations. Now taxation, do not think every time we are talking about the taxation on individual persons. Now let's say company taxes, corporate taxes. Now under these BOI schemes, now industrial zones. Now to attract the foreign direct investments, government should give some tax holidays, those kind of activities. Otherwise, these foreign direct investors, they will have lot of options, lot of other countries, they can go and invest that particular industry. Now, once they invest, our government should have a control or negotiate with them. Okay, they can have, let's say, 60% local people. If people has to work, maybe they have to pay a major amount in local currency. All the things they can mention, but they can give some tax holidays. Then these companies, they will come and invest in a country like Sri Lanka. Otherwise, they will go to the Bangladesh, Vietnam, Malaysia, Korea. So many other options they are having. Then other main thing is rural development for income redistribution. Now, when you see this income redistribution, there is a huge gap between poor and rich people in Sri Lanka. Then trade pacts to promote exports. Provision of essential inputs like health, education, law, and order and defense. That means political stability is very much important. Then suppress heavily taxed goods with negative externalities. Create public goods with positive externalities. Now, every time you have to you have to create positive externalities, you have to suppress the negative externalities, providing funds at low interest. Now, you have to provide these funds for low interest. If let's say if a Sri Lankan company wants to invest on a, let's say, pharmaceutical company, maybe a tire company, then they have to provide Government should intervene and provide these facilities. Then government policy on economic stability. Then managing price stability, low inflation. That's the most important thing. Maintaining exchange rate, keeping interest rates stable, managing budget deficit. Now, it is very difficult managing the budget deficit because we are taking a historical deficit from, I think, 1948 onwards. We are having a deficit. Now it's an accumulated deficit. One day this accumulation will blast. Now we are facing that blast during this period. Keeping debt levels under control. I think that's none of the government, they haven't do it properly. Now, let's say, think about yourself. Let's say if you take so many loans, okay, banks will give you the loans, but you should think, how do you pay back these loans? Then, during crisis, what kind of things we can do now, how to overcome these things? Stimulus packages and austerity measures. Now, poor people, you have to give some packages. Otherwise, they will suffer to a worse condition. Then, that's why I think, okay, maybe it's different names. They come up with the this program called Assessment. Is controlling government budget deficit. Now, how do you control? Government have a income and the government have a expenditure. Now, if the government expenditure is too high, then the Sri Lankan government will have a budget deficit. Then how do you control? They will control by cutting the expenses as well as increasing the taxes from the people as well as the companies. But the other main thing is they have to promote foreign direct investments. Now, within the country, whatever the thing, let's say if you adopt 100% tax from the country's people, you may not be able to compensate the government expenditure if the expenditure is too much. Now, that's why still our government is telling our monthly expenditure is around 600 to 700 billion Sri Lankan rupees. Our monthly income, government income, is around 150 to 200 billion Sri Lankan rupees. That means every month we are having around 450, 500 billion deficit. Then now with this present tax level, people maybe around 30-35% people are paying tax. Now let's say if the people they impose 100% tax also, they can get around 400 to 500 billion Sri Lankan rupees. Then what would happen to the people? That means people do not have any money to spend. That you can't do. Only thing is to to come out from this recession, you have to take foreign direct investment. To get the foreign direct investment, you have to have the political stability, economic stability, and social welfare schemes as well. Then transfers and poverty alleviation programs for social stability. That's the most important thing. Now, during this crisis, poor people will have a huge impact because their day-to-day, most of these poor people, they earn daily basis salaries. Now, they will do some labor works and other things. Now, once these construction companies, they close their projects, majority of the laborers, they do not have any job. Then what would be the impact to their families? With some social welfare programs, you have to look into that kind of people. You can't ignore these people. Then to do that one, government need money. Then they will impose the higher taxation. Then public investment to create infrastructure leaves space for private sector growth. That's also very important thing. You have to promote the private sector. Then structural adjustment. Make state sector focus and efficient. That's also now everyone is talking about the reforms, privatization, everything. Then government may not able to run their government entities. That's the issue. Now Sri Lankan, CPC, CEB, then other ministries, every time, everything, they may not able to run. Why? Their expenses are very high than the income. Then when the government revenue is and government expenditure and deficit. Sorry. Now I told that there are two policies. Now here just think about when you will have to adopt the expansionary policies and when you have to have the contractionary policies. Those are the two terms, very important thing. It can be deficit, very common, not enough revenue to meet expenditure or overspending when economy is not doing well. Now that's our case. That means when the government spends more than it taxes. Now we are having that situation. That means government spends more than it taxes. Then government should promote expansionary policies. Why? They want to expand the economy. That means they want to they have to improve the exports, all the things. When it's a surplus, very rare, means the government makes good revenue or being stingy when economy doing well. When the government taxes, not only the government taxes here, government income is more than its expenditure. Then, okay, when you have a surplus, normally in our situation, we do not have that kind of situation. Every time we are having a deficit situation, balance situation also very rare cases. When you consider the worldwide, every country, they are having some deficit. Most of the countries having deficits. Okay, maybe countries like Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, those kind of countries, they will have a surplus like that. Then when a deficit situation, you have to identify what kind, that's the main thing. I think Sri Lankan government, when they declare the bankruptcy or the bailout situation, they didn't know what is the deficit even, because they mentioned, okay, 40 billion, 50 billion, 60 billion, 80 billion, some say more than 100 billion. Then out of that 100 billion, what kind of foreign component, what kind of local component, all the things they should know. Then the frequency of the deficit, then how do you finance that deficit? That's also very much important. Now, what are the methods they can use to finance the deficit? Then controls on business cycle, direct or indirect. Then other thing is the taxation. Now, when you look at the tax, so many taxations, income tax, corporate tax, pay as you tax, VAT, trade taxes, so many taxation. That's the revenue of the government. That whatever the method, government has to earn a revenue. Only way of only revenue source is the tax to the government. Other way, government can't do any other thing. Government is not doing any business. government earn through the taxation. But that tax, whatever the money they get it as a taxation, whether they utilize it in a proper way or not, it's a different story. Now they can go for a direct taxes, could be progressive, that means income tax, pay tax, corporate tax, then indirect taxes, that those taxes directly passes to the consumer. Now social security levy, now that's the latest tax, whatever the amount, whatever the bill you are doing, now they will add another 2.5 and put it, consider it as the social security levy, then the VAT. Okay, those are the things. Then what are the sources of finance? That's also very important thing. That means foreign sources, domestic market sources, then they can get the bank financing from local banks as well. Now here foreign sources, we can take concessional borrowings, institutional borrowings, foreign market borrowings. Now our main issue is to bridge the gap between the this balance of payment, mainly the short-term borrowings. When you go to a foreign finance the short-term borrowings, we have to go for a foreign market borrowing. Now these foreign market borrowings, their interest rates are very high. Now institutional borrowings means we are getting loans from the IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, like that. Concessional borrowings means maybe government to government financing. Then domestic market sources, treasury bonds, non-market sources, or the banks. Now, what is the impact? Now, when you do, you have to think about non-inflationary but issue of crowding out. Now, when you go for the domestic loans, it have an impact on the inflation. Now, the local banks, they do not have sufficient money. They have to collect the money. Now, how they will collect the money? They will pay higher interest rates. Now, just think about, I do not know whether you will open the fixed deposit for a 25%, 28%, 30%. Previously, banks offered that kind of interest rates to you. Now, do you think these banks will honor that interest rates to you? Now, that's the issue. Now, let's say if the bank, if you open a fixed deposit for a 25%, now bank has to invest that particular amount to earn more than 25% to pay you 25%. Now they may have gone to treasury bonds. During that time, treasury bonds, they gave around 30%. Now, once the government is giving 30% to the bank, now government has to invest that particular money on a project more than earning 30%. Now, during that time, now during this crisis situation in Sri Lanka, we didn't have any project that will earn more than 30% earnings for a particular year. Now, if they adopt the debt restructuring, treasury bonds, they will say, okay, now these banks will say, instead of 30%, central bank will give 18%. Then they will pass that to consumer and say, now we promise you to give you 25%, we will give you 15%. Then what will happen to suddenly? Now you do not have any other option because money is with the bank. Otherwise, you have to withdraw your capital. That's maybe you can get. But for your investment, instead of 25%, bank may say, okay, we will give you 10 to 12% interest rate. Okay, now that's the way you have to go with this domestic debt restructuring. Okay, Now just think that these things I will just show. I am not going into the details. This is the central bank report for year 2022. Now you can see our real GDP growth, it's minus. Trade balances, all minus. Current account balance, minus. Now, my main objective is of giving some idea about these economic terms to understand this central bank report or the economic indicators published by the central bank or other institution. Now just think about, now here on 2018, they mention our real GDP as 2.3 plus. Then 2019 it's minus, to 2020 it's minus, 2021 they put 3.5, but they mention it as B. That means provisional. That means they may not able to calculate these values correctly. Actually, during that time, during these IMF programs, they criticize our reports. They mentioned that all these values, they were manipulated values. Okay, that's the issue. I am here not going into the details. Just think about this. And this is the economy at glance. Now here in 2022, our service sector, there is a reduction. Now real GDP contracted by 7.8% in 2022 compared to the growth of 3.5% in, now here they mentioned as the positive value. Now think about 3.5% growth. Now it has been changed to minus 7.8 contract. Then you have to think whether in 2021, whether our government has published correct picture of the country. That may happen, because if they manipulate these values and show that country is developing, but real picture is not there, that will have a huge impact. Now see, service sector decline, industry sector decline, agriculture sector decline, taxes decline. But 2023, they impose a huge taxation policy to recapture these values. Then overall size of the economy. Now previously we had a 88.5 US dollar billion economy, but it has been contracted 70 to 77.1. Now you can see population is safe, then our per capita GDP drastically reduce. Now let's say sometimes this, there are definitions about the developing countries and the developing countries. They identify with this per capita GDP. Now here you can see the annual real GDP growth. Now every year we showed huge positive values. Okay. Now suddenly from 2019 onwards, these values in 2021 also they have showed the positive value, but all the other years they have shown its negative values. Okay. That does not mean these values are really correct. If these values are correct, our country may not pass through this kind of situation. That means they have, okay, maybe it's a government policy. They may want to show the country is developing, but the true picture is not there. Maybe during that time, they may have hide so many information, or maybe they have taken so much borrowings and show the values using these borrowings. But the real, once the government has to repay these borrowings, the real picture will come through. Okay, now everywhere you can see our statistics are negative. Okay, now agriculture sector, industry sector, service sector. Okay, but now from 2023 onwards, we can see some positive values, but still we do not know whether these values are correct or not. But with the IMF uh, guidelines, now they have to reflect, because we have to do it in a proper transparent way. Now there are missions, they are coming to Sri Lanka and they will check these values. They want the real picture of the country. Now you can see the inflation. Now here, now previously we showed the inflation like that, then suddenly it increase around more than 70%. This is the head. I am not going into the details about all the things. When you explain it, you can just mention inflation is increase. Now with the intervention of the government, okay, maybe I am not telling this intervention is perfectly correct or not, or maybe you will have your own political views on these things. But here I am trying to explain it with the whatever the intervention of the, what is the main intervention? They have a stringent ban on the imports, and also they had a huge taxation on the public, then public expended. That means the consumer behavior. That means consumers, they do not have sufficient money to spend. They have government has imposed a self-control to the people, and also they put a very high interest rate on the credit cards and other things. Then people, they are not using the credit cards like that, okay, because the interest rate is too much. Then automatically spending, they have controlled it. Now tourism, you can see the latter part of the 2023 we are getting. Now here trade balances, every time we had a negative value. Now worker remittances increasing, balance of payment. Now every year we are having now now these years 2020, 21, 2022, but in 2023 we had a balance of payment positive value. Mainly, this is mainly due to we are having the huge import restriction, but we do not know whether these things will sustain for the future, but government should intervene to sustain it. Okay, here I am not going all the things. Now here you can see the official reserves. Now we had huge official reserves. It's like 10 billion US dollar. Now we are having around 1 to 2 US dollar billion. Okay, now let's say if we are having a 2 billion US dollar reserve, means country cannot do anything, because our country, for the to import the fuel itself, we have to spend around previously 500 to 600 million. But with the introduction of this QR system, it was controlled to around 250, 300 million. Okay, but you may not able to control all those things, but now indirectly they are controlling by increasing the fuel price. Now that's the indirect control of the spending of the people. Otherwise, if the government is giving the fuel, let's say 150 Sri Lankan rupees per liter, people will consume more fuel, and there will be a huge impact on the fuel for expenditure through a foreign currency. Now these imbalances, you can see government revenue, one of the lowest in the world, expenditure remained rigid. Government expenditure, overall fiscal deficit. We are having a deficit, the third highest deficit in 20 years. That means we are having 10.2% of the GDP. That means our deficit is 10.2% of the GDP. That means now whatever we produce, out of that around 10, now let's say if we are having 80 billion GDP or 100 billion GDP, our deficit is 10.2% of the GDP. Now deficit, we should not have a deficit in physical terms. Now you can see the government debt. Now whatever the earnings we are receiving, it's more than the government debts. Now government debts is debt debt means the payments we have to carry out. That means our GDP is not sufficient. Now let's say if we spend all the GDP, gross domestic product, that means whatever the goods and services produced within the country, without spending anything, that means if government take a decision, okay, we use all these GDP value to pay the debt, still we are not able to pay the debt. Normally it should be less than 100%. Maybe ideally if we can have a lower value, that should be better at least. Now it's like that. Now if you take a housing loan and if you do not pay, the bank will come and mortgage the house and they will try to settle the housing loan through the mortgage. But if your housing loan is excess, if the value is more than the value of the house, what shall we do? Now in our country situation, our debts are more than the value of the goods and services produced within the country. Then what is the option government can do? Government can do sell their assets. That's the issue. Then with that, our country sovereign ratings, all the things they have degraded, downgrade all the things. Then that downgrades, there is a constraints the access of foreign financing. Now let's say if private sector wants to build some factory or maybe a power plant or maybe some investment, normally they have to go to foreign banks, foreign financial institutions. Then they will look into these credit ratings of the country. Once they see the downgraded ratings, they may not give the financings to these developers, or otherwise they may say we have to add additional premiums, additional insurance risks, though that means we have to pay some additional premiums as a risk. Then what are the interest rates? Now interest rates also previously very high, now it's somewhat stable. Budget deficit, now every time we had a deficit. Okay, now this is the deficit, not the positive value, it's the deficit. We had every year from 2000 onwards, we had a deficit. Now this deficit, it's cumulatively have an impact. Maybe these years due to the COVID and other crises in the country, now it has been reflect into the every area of the Sri Lanka. Now just think about rising inflation led to severe deterioration of living conditions of the public and substantial hardships to businesses. Now public sector, you are getting a salary, whether your nominal salary. That means whatever the thing you are getting and what is the real value of the salary. Then private sector, informal, private sector, that means normal day-to-day life, what kind of impact you are getting. Now you may think your wages, real wages, you are getting value. Maybe previously you received, let's say 100,000, still you may have received 100,000. Whether that 100,000 is same as the previous 100,000. But your expenditure is huge. Now that 100,000 may not be sufficient. Now, before you get 100,000, now you may not get the 100,000. Government has imposed a tax. Okay, maybe now you are getting 75,000. Now, after deducting the tax, now when you take that 75,000 to the to your bank, now they will deposit that 75 cents to the bank as a salary. Now you have to pay all these utility bills. All these utility bills also increase. Gas prices increase, water prices increase. Maybe your transportation costs, you have to go to the office, all the things they have increased. Ultimately, you do not have sufficient money to do your basic needs. Maybe you have to maintain your family, you have to buy food for your family, medicine for your family, those things. That means that's the way your country's social aspects, that means the mainly your family having an impact due to these hardships. Then the government earmarked on strong fiscal consolidation path, primary based on revenue enhance. Now, how do they enhance the revenue? They have increased the VAT, they have introduced the tax surcharge, then SSCL they have it, then they are trying to expand the tax base. That means they mention all the persons above 18 should register on the tax. Now government, now here just think all the places, everywhere it's tax. Tax for individual persons, companies, and duties on petrol, diesel, cigarette, liquor. Now think about cigarette. Now it's, I think, around more than 200, 250. Then liquor. Think about those things. Okay. Now that's the only way government can enhance the revenue. That means government will get tax revenue, tax as the revenue to the government. Then, okay, one part is enhancing the tax, other part is expenditure rationalization. Now, guideline issues to minimize electricity and fuel uses. Then guideline issues to public sector to restrict non-urgent, non-essential expenses. Now, public sector, they cancel all the projects, payments to the contractors, all the things. Then reforms they are talking about, CP, CB, Sri Lankan, all the things. Then cost reflective pricing formulas. Now they are not giving any subsidies. Now they want, now fuel, they are taking whatever the price. Now suddenly they increase the fuel prices. But now people has to accept it, because why? Now IMF condition is we have to impose the cost reflective pricing formulas. That's the thing. So many things here. Main objective is enhance the revenue, rationalize the expenditure, and minimize the deficit. That's the main thing they are talking about. Now they want to minimize the deficit. That's the objective. Okay. Now what, what is now everyone is talking about this engaging with IMF program. Why we have to go with the IMF? That's the main thing. Now, normally we entered into IMF program from time to time to support the BOP position. Now, that's the most important thing when the country had a deficit in the BOP. That means our foreign currency outflows are higher than the foreign currency inflows. Then country can't do anything. Then we need some method to inject the foreign currency into the country. Then normally this International Monetary Fund, they will come into this kind of situation and they will request so many stringent conditions because they will go through one by one and they will see why they will try to find the root cause. That means this situation will arise mainly because poor management about the balance of payment. Then they will say, okay, you have to control or you have to take stringent actions to control the government expenditure. In the current context, IMF will be an important part of strategies to overcome prevailing challenging economic conditions in the country, considering current low level of international reserves. That means in Sri Lanka, we do not have international reserves, servicing significantly high debt repayments. That's also there. Now, that's why they mention country has to go through this debt restructuring. Then liquidity in domestic foreign exchange market has dried up amid high foreign debt, service payment and reduction in foreign exchange inflows. Now we do not have sufficient dollars in the market. Then government decided to go with the IMF. Okay, maybe political views may be different. Maybe someone can say no, the government may have another option, another way to overcome this situation. Whatever the thing, this government has decided to engage with the IMF program. What are the areas they expected to get the IMF support? First one is the fiscal consolidation, appropriate monetary policy stance. Maybe once you go with this IMF program, government can easily say, we are adopting we are adopting the IMF conditions. Then the exchange rate flexibility, phasing out of monetary financing. Now here, monetary financing means as soon as government accept the IMF rules, IMF requested, okay, you may not, government cannot print the money as they want. They have to control. Then how do they get the additional money? They request to increase the taxation, because IMF, let's say they are giving the foreign currency support to the country. Maybe they are getting that money from the other countries' taxpayers' money. Maybe developed countries, they will give money to the IMF to go support to the financial aids to the other countries. It's not grants or aids, it's a loans to other countries, but this money they collected from the other countries people's taxations, and they are not giving this money to the country like Sri Lanka, and they will say, okay, first you will collect your own money and show it that you have a commitment, those things, and then we will give the support to you. But these conditions may be very stringent, maybe very have a very negative impact to the society, but you may have to do those things. Then they may request price adjustment to the prices for the domestic petroleum, LP gas to reflect the cost. Now, in previously, when we have an election, political party who control the country, they will just say, okay, we will reduce the gas by this amount. Maybe we will reduce the electricity by this amount. But actually, those kind of situations definitely have an impact to our cost reflective tariff schemes. But if we have a cost reflective tariff schemes and other things, now people request, okay, I am not telling whether it's correct or not. Now there are subsidies. Now these subsidies you should not give through this electricity or the gas or water. Subsidy should give to the poor people in a different way. Maybe as a sum of the or as a more that kind of program you have to give, let's say, some amount. With that amount they have to pay the cost reflective tariff. Let's say if poor people using 60 units of electricity, you have to give that electricity at a cost reflective tariff. But to overcome the financial burden with respect to that particular person, you may have to give some financial benefit through another scheme, not through the electricity or water or gas. Now, whatever the way these telecom providers operate, they will. Do you think these telecom providers they will give concession to the poor people? No. If you go to communication place, they will give okay recharge of 50 rupees, 100 rupees. It's immaterial whether you are low income group or the high income group. 100 rupee recharge means 100 rupee recharge. But for the electricity, water, they will give you the concessionary rate. But that concession should give in a different way. Then, but all the products, they have to give it as a cost reflective tariff. That's the condition imposed by this IMF program. Okay, just go through other things. Then what are the present challenges in Sri Lankan economy? Now, we have to go with the structural impediments. Weak economic management over the years left the economy vulnerable and the country entered the pandemic with limited buffers. Now we had to go through this COVID situation, all the things. We didn't have sufficient buffers, reserves, but during that time, luckily, we had sufficient agricultural products within the country. But that also had a huge impact with this fertilizer issue and other things. Sri Lanka vulnerability was aggravated by policy mistakes and multiple shocks. Actually, inconsistent policies, that's the main important thing I want to highlight it here. Now, let's say other Western countries, why they developed and we consider as underdeveloped country, because most of the countries which, if you analyze, they had the very good consistent policies. All the countries categorized as the underdeveloped countries had inconsistent policies. Mostly these policies were developed and influenced by the relevant political parties, not only one, everyone. Then enhancing domestic resource mobilizations will critical to addressing macroeconomic vulnerability and imbalances. Improving state-owned enterprises performance would lighten the fiscal burden. Now that's the most important thing. Just think about the deaths of Sri Lankan Airlines, CPC, CEB. Why these deaths occurred? They couldn't give that cost-reflective tariff. Whatever the thing, now it says they have to pass the actual cost. Then automatically people will decide whether to consume the electricity or not. Okay, they may have a self-control. You have to give it for cost-reflective tariff. I am not telling whether they have managed it properly or if inefficiency. Those things, different things. But all these services should represent the cost-reflective tariff. Then strengthening public financial management and fiscal rules would improve fiscal discipline and monetary policy. Safeguarding bank soundness and financial sector stability are essential for the growth. Now, that's the other thing. Now, whether this debt restructuring of EPF is correct or not, it's a different story. Why they impose only to the EPF is another story. But safeguarding bank soundness, that's the most important thing. Policies are needed to make the private sector more competitive and enable to engage more effectively in external trade. This private sector engagement is mainly important. Another main thing is social protection is urgent, requires strengthened procedures and transparency. Social protection definitely you have to do during this kind of situation. Otherwise, poor people may not survive. Then corruption and poor governance have undermined economic growth and stability. That also you have to overcome. Now here some slides I have copied from the recent central bank report. You can see what are the things our country now carrying out to overcome the present situation, carrying out long overdue reforms. Now these reforms, okay, not only the state-owned enterprises, financial sector, fiscal sector, monetary sector, everywhere we are talking about reforms. Why? We have to, under reforms, you may expect to have a good control of the process. Effective prioritization and utilization of external financing for external debt sustainability in the post-restructuring period. Now, that's the other most important thing. Now, whatever the borrowings we are getting from the external entities, we have to prioritize and utilize it in an effective manner. Successful implementation of the debt restructuring process. That's the most important thing. We have to request the foreign countries that Sri Lanka may able to pay the loans, maybe not in near future, and maybe we have to have that discussion. Long overdue structural reforms to restructure loss-making state-owned enterprises. Lack of consistent taxation policies. Need for efficient expenditure rationalization strategies for sustainable fiscal consolidation. Now, here mainly all these facts related to the consistent policies. Now, here we are talking about the fiscal policy, monetary policy, tax policy, reform policies, all the things. Now, reforms, let's say if we are going ahead with the reforms of, let's say, CPC or CEB, that kind of organization, Sri Lankan Airlines, maybe next minister or maybe the next government, they have to continue that processes. Then energy insecurities of the country. That's also you have to address. Whatever the country to develop, we have to have the secured energy supply, not only the electricity, overall energy. Institutional and legislative reforms are warranted to strengthen the oversight of public expenditure management. That's also very much important. This public expenditure means the government expenditure. Now, in our previous situation, if the president wants, he will start the project. Maybe the next president comes, he will do another project like that. But those are not in line with the overall long-term government policies. Export sector policies need to focus on improving the sophistication of goods and services. Reorientation of national trade policy. Now we have to go for a trade policies. Maybe with the other countries, we have to Sri Lanka should have the favorable conditions. Exploiting non-liability creating investment is critical for that means FDIs we have to considering low FDI over last few decades. Now you have to compare why we couldn't attract these foreign direct investments. Now maybe someone can say corruption, political interference. Actually, those are the real factors. Now how to overcome these things? Measure to increase tourist arrivals and proper network to capture tourism markets. Then mass migration of professionals and skilled workers is likely to be lead to a substantial drop in productivity. That also we have to address. Then improving the resilience of small and medium scale enterprise sector. Now, once this economic crisis happened, the small and medium scale enterprises were collapsed because they may need everyday finances like the working capital financing and other things to pay the salaries and other things. The bank loan interests were very high. They may not be able to sustain. Then downward rigidity in domestic prices of import goods remains a concern, lowering the domestic cost of living. Now, you can reduce the cost of living by importing the low cost items. That you have to think. Urgent need to reformulate policy strategies, ensure the welfare of most vulnerable groups. Now that's the most important thing. You have to identify the correct people. Now you have to think whether the Samurti program or Sasumus program, whether the correct people are getting this benefit. Most of the people is like a political system. The national policy planning mechanism and holistic implementation. That's the mostly lacking thing. Every ministry, they do the work their own. They are not looking at the holistic implementation. The reliance of the public sector on the banking system. Then policy inconsistency in domestic agricultural sector. That's also a very important thing. Now, I think everyone knows that we had a huge inconsistency in the agricultural sector. As soon as agricultural sector collapse, there will be a huge impact that you have to import the basic food items from the foreign countries. Then long overdue of factor market reforms. That means everyone is talking, we have to go for the market systems, but that's overdue. Then acceleration in digitalization of economy remains vital. Why you need the digitalizations? That will introduce the systems. Once you introduce the systems, this corruption and transparent corruption you can reduce, then the transparency also you can improve. Due regard to preserving the environment is vital for ensuring the sustainable growth. That you have to see. Now we are focusing on expand the exports. We have to go with the self-sufficiency in the agriculture sector, self-sufficiency in the energy sector, but you should not compromise the environment aspect. Then sustainable recovery hinges on undertaking much needed reforms expeditiously. Now these reforms, now you may think why here they are explaining all the things and not carry out these tasks. Okay, that's the government has to initiate these reforms. Maybe someone can ask, first they have to reform the parliament itself. Okay, that. But all the things in theoretical aspects, whatever the thing, let's say if we can achieve around 50 to 60% of these activities, definitely Sri Lanka can overcome these challenges. With that, I will conclude my session. Please read this note as at least once. Try to grab the important points. Here the important mainly how to overcome the challenges. Then when you write these challenges, you have to just explain something relevant to the economic aspects, economic, political, social aspects of the country. Do you have any questions? Because I have to cover a lot, but do not memorize anything. Just go through the notes at least 1 or 2 times. I know that you will have 4 questions to write, and there are 4 sections. Every section you have to take only 1 question. It's up to you to write this question or not. It's up to you. But here most of the things you can write, you can attend these questions with your general knowledge. Maybe just watch the TV and other things. Most of the answers you can write by going through my notes as well. But no need to memorize anything. Just read and take the concept. I think most of the things you can link with the present situation of the country. I think after you read this one, maybe you may think all the things, if most of the things government has to do, yes, government has to do, but they have failed. Why they failed? We didn't have inconsistent policies. We had the policies, but all these policies, so many influences. But other developing countries, they have systems, whether the government change these particular decisions, they are carrying out because they are taking the decisions as a central system. But every government, they will guide to carry out these policies. With that, I will conclude my lecture. I will wish you all the best to the exam. If you have any question, please. Okay, thank you very much. Then, do you have any question? Hope by going through the notes, but do not write just point form. Just try to explain it 2-3 sentences every item. And do not spend much time on only my question. You have to write 4 questions. Otherwise, you may not get the pass mark. Because I know that previously, for my question, some students, I think they have written more than 8 to 10 pages. Whatever thing, you can get maximum 25 marks for my question. But other questions you have to try. Okay, then shall we stop?
Okay, sir.
Okay.